Here's something that genuinely puzzled historians for a long time. Ancient people, we're talking thousands of years before walls, before rooms, before locks, somehow managed to have private lives, real ones. And not because they were less human than us or didn't need space. They needed it just as much as you do. They just solved the problem in a way that nobody talks about. And when you find out how, it reframes basically everything we think we know about how ancient societies actually functioned day to day. Because the solution wasn't architectural, it was social. And it was so effective that it built every major civilization on Earth before anyone ever thought to put up a wall. Let's get into it. Go back 23,000 years. Northern Israel. A site archaeologists call Ohalo II. Researchers excavating this site found something fascinating. The remains of sleeping areas clustered inside shelters barely larger than a modern bathroom. Multiple people per shelter. No internal divisions. No separate spaces. Just bodies, close together, every night. And Ohalo II isn't unusual. It's consistent. Across archaeological sites on every continent, the same pattern shows up. Hunter-gatherer groups of roughly 25 to 50 people, sharing sleeping space with no physical separation between individuals. No walls inside, no private corners, no room that belonged to one person. Now the instinct is to look at that and think, okay, primitive, temporary, something they were working their way out of. But here's what the archaeology actually shows. This wasn't a problem waiting to be solved. The closeness was deliberate. On cold nights with no insulation and no central heating, the warmth of other bodies was survival technology. The sounds of 50 people breathing around you was your early warning system against predators. Staying packed together wasn't a limitation. It was the smartest possible design given the constraints. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer populations. The Kungsan in the Kalahari, the Hadza in Tanzania, the Agta in the Philippines, find the same pattern still functioning today. Elders, children, adults of every age sharing the same ground. Fires burning at the center. Everyone within arm's reach of everyone else. So the question that immediately comes up, and historians sat with this for a long time, is how did anyone have a private moment in any of this? How did ancient humans manage interior life, personal space, intimate relationships, in conditions where you were never technically alone? The answer is one of the more elegant social inventions in human history, and it has nothing to do with architecture. The forest was the solution. In virtually every hunter-gatherer society on record, physical separation from the group served the exact same function that a locked door serves today. When a person needed to be alone, they walked into the trees. No formal permission required. No social negotiation. No explanation owed to anyone. The understanding was simply this: a person who has moved beyond the firelight has gone somewhere and is not to be followed. That was the rule, unwritten, unspoken, but absolute. And violating it carried real social consequences in communities where your reputation with every single person in the group was the only social infrastructure you had. There were no institutions, no courts, no formal systems of recourse. Your relationships were everything, which meant the invisible rules governing those relationships were enforced harder than any written law. Anthropologist Daniel Everett documented this in detail while living with the Pirahã people of the Amazon. Western visitors kept arriving, expecting to find a people with no concept of privacy, because they had no walls, no rooms, no physical separation. What they found instead confused them. The Pirahã seemed completely unbothered by being visible. They conducted their lives in full view of the group without apparent discomfort. But Everett's observation was more precise than that. The Pirahã didn't lack privacy. They had located it in time and distance rather than in space. The forest was their door. The unspoken agreement was their lock. Researcher Kim Sterelny later formalized this distinction: physical privacy versus social privacy. Two separate technologies that solve the same human problem. One uses architecture, the other uses collective agreement. And Sterelny's argument was that the social version is actually the older and more sophisticated invention, because it requires the entire community to maintain it on behalf of each individual, constantly, without anyone having to ask. That's not primitive. That's extraordinarily complex social engineering. And it worked well enough to sustain human life and culture for 300,000 years before anyone built the first interior wall. But here's what makes this genuinely interesting from a historical standpoint. The system had a hard boundary, and that boundary was set by the landscape itself. Darkness and predators defined the outer edge of how far from the fire any person could realistically go. The firelight was safety. Everything beyond it was risk, which meant privacy, real, functional privacy, existed in a very specific zone, far enough from the group that you couldn't easily be observed. Close enough to the fire that returning was still safe. That gap between observation and danger is where ancient humans carved out their private lives. It wasn't infinite. It wasn't comfortable in the way a room is comfortable. But it was real, and it was respected. Sexual privacy worked along exactly these lines. Researchers studying contemporary forager societies consistently find that couples don't disappear for hours. They move a short distance from the sleeping group, conduct themselves in relative darkness, and return. The group is aware of what is happening. Nobody pretends otherwise. What functions as privacy here is not concealment. It's the group's collective decision not to acknowledge what it can technically perceive. The social convention is doing the work that architecture does in a modern house. And this distinction between physical concealment and social agreement shows up again when you look at what happened to privacy as human societies started to change. About 10,000 years ago, something shifted. Populations began settling. Villages appeared. And with villages came something new, permanent structures with internal divisions. Archaeologists excavating sites in the ancient Near East found clear evidence of rooms set apart from common areas as early as 7000 BCE. Çatalhöyük in modern Turkey is one of the best documented examples. A dense, interconnected settlement where individual living spaces were accessible only through roof openings, each household separated from the next. But here's the thing historians find interesting about Çatalhöyük. Those spaces weren't private in the modern sense. They weren't personal. They marked divisions of status and function, separating households from guest areas, living spaces from the areas beneath the floors where the dead were buried. The concept of a room as a space belonging to one individual person, serving that person's need for solitude, is much more recent than the room itself. For most of settled human history, a bed was the most expensive object a family owned. Guests shared it. Travelers stopping at an inn slept alongside strangers. The private bedroom, one person, one bed, one room, didn't become standard even in wealthy European households until well into the 17th century. What changed it, ultimately, wasn't a shift in values or philosophy. It was cost. When construction materials became cheap enough that internal walls were affordable to ordinary people, private space became something ordinary people could have. When heating became reliable enough that you didn't need to crowd into one room for warmth, people began to separate. Historian Norbert Elias made an argument in 1939 that historians still debate, that physical privacy and personal shame developed together, and neither came first. The room and the feeling evolved simultaneously. Before walls, the body simply wasn't a private thing. After walls, it became one. So the next time you think about ancient people living in the open, no walls, no rooms, no locked doors, don't picture people waiting for civilization to arrive. Picture a society that had worked out through thousands of years of trial and consequence, a system of invisible rules so well understood that nobody needed to write them down, a system where the forest was the door, distance was the lock, and the community itself maintained your privacy on your behalf. That system built every civilization that ever existed before someone worked out how to make cheap bricks. The room came later. The need it was solving, that's as old as the species. If you want to go deeper on how ancient people solved problems we still haven't cracked, subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from.